The world changed in a single generation. It changed with fire and blood, with the beating of great wings, and with the screams of men who thought their stone walls could protect them. For thousands of years, the Seven Kingdoms had warred among themselves, petty kings rising and falling, houses claiming and losing crowns, blood feuds stretching back to the age of heroes. Then Aegon Targaryen came from across the narrow sea with his sister wives and 3 dragons, and suddenly the old world meant nothing at all. One by one the kingdoms fell. The Riverlands bent the knee after Harrenhal burned. The Stormlands submitted when their king died in single combat. The Reach saw its armies turned to ash on the field of fire. The Westerlands bowed rather than face the same fate. The Vale yielded without a battle, its young boy king counselled by wise men who understood what dragons meant. Even the North, ancient and proud, sent their king in the north to bend the knee before Aegon's new throne, a throne made of the melted swords of the conquered. 6 kingdoms fell, 6 crowns were surrendered or torn from dead men's heads, and then there was one. Dorne, the southernmost kingdom, land of red mountains and endless deserts, remained free. While Aegon Targaryen called himself King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm, the Martells of Sunspear answered to no one. Their banner, a red sun pierced by a golden spear, still flew over their own castles, and their princess ruled as she always had, without a dragon's shadow falling over her throne. This was an insult Aegon could not ignore. More than an insult, it was a crack in the foundation of everything he had built. If Dorne remained independent, then the other kingdoms might wonder why they had surrendered. Rebellions could spark. Ambitious lords could dream of crowns again. No, Dorne had to bend. Everyone had to bend. That was the only way the peace could hold. So Aegon sent his messenger. The man who rode south carried no army, only a letter sealed with the 3-headed dragon of House Targaryen. He travelled through the Prince's Pass, past the watchtowers of House Ironwood, down into the lands where the air shimmered with heat, and the mountains gave way to red sands. He reached Sunspear, the seat of House Martell, where the Greenblood met the Summer Sea, and the old Rhoynish towers stood beside newer keeps of Dornish stone. There he was brought before Princess Meria Martell. She was old, older than anyone could quite remember. Some said she'd seen 80 name days. Others claimed she was well past 90. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her hair white as bone, and her eyes were milky and sightless, clouded by the cataracts of extreme age. She had been blind for years, but she still ruled Dorne with a mind as sharp as obsidian. They called her the Yellow Toad of Dorne, for her looks and her reputation. She was neither beautiful nor kind, neither merciful nor forgiving. But she was Dorne, and Dorne was her. The messenger knelt before her chair and read Aegon's letter aloud. The words were simple and direct. Aegon offered peace. He offered Dorne a place in his new kingdom, a chance to bend the knee with honour rather than in ashes. He promised that House Martell would keep their lands, their incomes, their privileges. All they had to do was acknowledge him as their king. It was a generous offer, really, far more generous than what Harren the Black had received, or the Gardener kings who died with their army on the field of fire. Meria Martell listened in silence. When the messenger finished, the hall was quiet. Outside, the sound of the sea could be heard, waves rolling against the sandy shores. Inside, the courtiers and guards waited to hear what their princess would say. She smiled then. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "You may tell your Dragon King this," she said, her voice still strong despite her years. "Dorne has no king. Tell him that he may burn us, he may kill us, he may scatter our bones across the red sands and the mountain peaks, but he will not bend us. We will not kneel. Not to him, not to his sisters, not to his dragons. We are Dorne. We do not bend." The messenger rode back north with those words. When Aegon heard them, he must have known what they meant. War. Not the kind of war he had fought before. Those had been quick, decisive, brutal, but brief. This would be something else. Something slower, more painful, harder to finish. But Aegon had dragons, and Dorne had only spears and stubbornness. How long could they last? The answer, as it turned out, was longer than anyone expected. To understand why Dorne believed it could defy the greatest power in the known world, you have to understand what Dorne is. It is not like the other kingdoms. The north is vast but cold, its people hardy but concentrated around their keeps and castles. The reach is fertile and rich, its fields producing the food that feeds the realm. The Westerlands have gold, the Riverlands have rivers. But Dorne? Dorne has nothing anyone wants, and everything makes it impossible to hold. The Red Mountains form a natural barrier along its northern border, cutting Dorne off from the rest of Westeros. There are only two passes through those mountains, the Prince's Pass and the Boneway, and both are narrow, treacherous, easy to defend. An army marching through either pass can be harassed, ambushed, picked apart by defenders who know every stone and shadow. South of the mountains, the land opens up into desert. Not the kind of desert that can be crossed in a few days. The true Dornish desert stretches for hundreds of miles, broken only by scattered oases and the occasional river valley. The heat is brutal, the sun merciless. Men not used to it die of thirst or exhaustion or sunstroke. Armor becomes an oven. Horses collapse. Water runs out faster than anyone plans for. The few towns and holdfasts that exist are spread far apart, built around water sources or sheltered valleys. There is no great city in the heart of Dorne, no capital to capture that would end the war. Sunspear itself sits on the coast, far to the southeast, surrounded by water and desert. An army trying to besiege it would have to march across half of Dorne just to get there. And by the time they arrived, they would be exhausted, depleted, vulnerable. This is the land Aegon's dragons had to conquer. This is the land Meria Martell ruled, and she had a plan. Meria understood something that many other rulers did not. She understood that you do not fight dragons the way you fight men. You do not line up your armies in neat formations and wait for the fire to come. You do not put your people in castles and hope the walls hold. Dragons laugh at walls. Dragons turn armies into ash. If you fight dragons the way everyone else fought them, you lose. So Dorne would not fight that way. Instead, Meria gave orders that spread throughout her realm. When the dragons come, do not stand and face them. Abandon your castles. Take your people, your animals, your food, and go into the mountains or the deep desert. Let the dragons burn empty stone. Let them scorch sand that will look the same tomorrow as it does today. Give them nothing to kill, nothing to conquer, nothing to hold. And when the dragons leave, because they cannot stay forever, come back, rebuild, wait. And when the Dragon King sends men instead of fire, then you fight. But you do not fight in the open. You do not march in formation. You ambush supply trains. You poison wells. You strike at night and disappear by dawn. You bleed them slowly, cut by cut, until they give up and go home. It was not a glorious strategy. There would be no great battles, no songs sung about valiant stands or heroic charges. But glory does not matter when you are facing dragons. Survival matters. Victory matters. And Meria Martell intended to survive. Her people understood. The Dornish are not like the Knights of the Reach or the Lords of the Westerlands. They are a different people, shaped by a different history. Centuries ago, the Rhoynar came across the narrow sea, fleeing the dragon lords of Valyria, and they brought their customs, their laws, their way of war. They married into the old Dornish houses, and the mixing of cultures created something new. In Dorne, women can inherit as easily as men. In Dorne, a spear is valued as much as a sword. In Dorne, pride is not about gold or glory. It is about never, ever kneeling. So when Meria Martell told her people that they would not bend, they believed her. When she told them to abandon their homes and let the dragons burn empty halls, they obeyed. They trusted her because she was one of them, and because she had never lied to them about what this would cost. It would cost everything. Castles would burn. Fields would be scorched. People would die. Not in battle, perhaps, but from starvation, from thirst, from the hardships of living like refugees in their own land. But they would not bend. That was the price of freedom, and the Dornish were willing to pay it. Aegon did not understand this yet. He thought Meria's refusal was pride, or foolishness, or the stubbornness of an old woman who did not realize the world had changed. He thought that once he showed Dorne what his dragons could do, they would see reason. He thought they would beg for mercy, as others had. He was wrong. The dragons came south, and with them came fire and death. But when the flames died and the smoke cleared, Aegon discovered something that no amount of fire could change. You cannot conquer sand. You cannot defeat a people who refuse to be defeated, and you cannot break those who will not bend. Meria Martell had given her answer. Now Aegon would learn what that answer truly meant. The First Dornish War was about to begin, and it would teach the Targaryens a lesson they would never forget. Dragons are powerful, yes. Dragons are terrifying, yes. But dragons are not invincible, and Dorne was about to prove it. The messenger returned to King's Landing with Meria's words, and Aegon Targaryen sat upon his new throne and considered what to do. His lords advised caution. Dorne was not worth the cost, they said. Let them keep their independence, as long as they do not threaten the realm. But Aegon couldn't do that. He had declared himself king of 7 kingdoms, not 6. If Dorne remained free, his crown was a lie. So he made his decision. He would go to Dorne himself, with his sisters and their dragons. He would show the Dornish what happened to those who defied him. He would burn their castles and break their armies and make them beg for the mercy he had offered them once before. And Meria Martell, blind and ancient and unbending, sat in Sunspear and waited. She knew the dragons were coming. She had always known. But she also knew that dragons bleed and dragon riders die, and even the mightiest kings can be worn down by time and distance and an enemy who will not surrender. The war was coming, and Dorne was ready. The dragons came with the dawn. Aegon Targaryen flew south on Balerion the Black Dread, the largest and most fearsome dragon the world had seen since the fall of Valyria. His sister Rhaenys rode Meraxes. her silver scales gleaming in the sunlight. His other sister wife, Visenya, came on Fargar, her dragon lean and savage. Together, the three of them had conquered 6 kingdoms. Together, they would bring Dorne to heel. Or so they believed. They flew over the Red Mountains, past the narrow defiles of the Boneway and the Prince's Pass, and looked down upon the land they meant to conquer. From above, Dorne stretched out like a vast expanse of red and gold, mountains giving way to desert, broken by river valleys and scattered holdfasts. It looked empty, peaceful even. But that emptiness should have been a warning. The first castle they reached was Skyreach, seat of House Fowler in the Prince's Pass. It was a strong keep, built into the mountains themselves, its towers rising high above the pass. A place like that should have been full of soldiers, archers lining the walls, banners flying in defiance. But when the dragons circled overhead, they saw nothing. No men on the walls, no banners, no movement at all. Aegon gave the command, and Balerion opened his jaws. Dragonfire poured down like a river of flame, so hot that stone cracked and wood turned to ash in seconds. The towers of Skyreach burned, their walls blackening, their roofs collapsing inward. When the flames finally died, the castle was a smoking ruin. But there were no screams, no bodies in the courtyard, no defenders dying at their posts. The castle had been empty. They flew on. Ironwood, the ancient seat of the Blood Royal, was next. It was one of the oldest and most powerful houses in Dorne, their castle a massive fortress that had stood for thousands of years. Surely they would make a stand here. Surely the Ironwoods would not abandon their ancestral home without a fight. But Ironwood was empty too. The gate stood open. The halls were silent. And when Meraxes bathed the castle in fire, the only thing that burned was stone and timber. No people, no soldiers, no one to conquer. It was the same everywhere they went. Castle after castle, holdfast after holdfast, all abandoned. The Dornish had taken Meria Martell's command to heart. They had packed what they could carry, driven their livestock into the mountains or deep into the desert, and vanished. Some went into the high peaks, hiding in caves and narrow valleys where dragons could not easily follow. Others went south into the great Dornish desert, where the heat and emptiness swallowed them whole. Aegon burned them all anyway. If the castles were empty, then he would leave nothing for the Dornish to return to. He would scorch their lands so thoroughly that they would have no choice but to come crawling back and beg for terms. Hellholt burned, Godsgrace burned, Vaith and Lemonwood and the Tor, all of them turned to ash and ruin. The dragons flew over the desert itself, looking for armies, for encampments, for anything that could be destroyed. Rhaenys took Meraxes low over the dunes, her dragon's shadow racing across the sand. But there was nothing. Just sand and rock and heat. The Dornish were gone, scattered like seeds on the wind, impossible to find in that vast and hostile emptiness. Weeks passed, then months. The Targaryens burned and burned, but there was nothing left to burn. No army came to face them, no lord rode out under a banner of truce. It was as if Dorne had simply ceased to exist. Its people vanished into the land itself. This was not war, as Aegon knew it. This was something else, something maddening. When you fight a battle, there is a clear beginning and a clear end. Armies meet, men fight, one side wins and the other loses. When you besiege a castle, you surround it, cut off its supplies, and wait until it surrenders or starves. There are rules to war, patterns that every commander understands. But Dorne was not following those rules. Dorne was fighting a war without battles, a siege without walls, and it was working. The dragons couldn't stay in the air forever. They needed to land, to rest, to feed. And when they did, the Dornish struck. Not in great charges or massed attacks, but in small, vicious raids. A scouting party would be found dead in the morning, throats cut, no sign of who had done it. A supply wagon would be ambushed in a mountain pass, its guards killed with spears and arrows, the goods taken or burned. Wells were poisoned, trails were blocked with rock slides, messengers disappeared. The Dornish were everywhere and nowhere. They moved through their own land like ghosts, striking when the dragons were absent, vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. They did not wear armor or carry banners. They were farmers and shepherds, traders and craftsmen, who picked up spears when the enemy came near and melted back into the population when the danger passed. This was the Dornish way of war. Not glorious, not honourable by the standards of Westerosi knighthood, but brutally effective. They could not defeat the dragons in open battle, so they did not try. Instead, they bled the invaders slowly, making every mile of Dornish land cost blood and sweat and frustration. Aegon grew furious. He had conquered the Stormlands in a single afternoon. He had broken the greatest army the Reach could muster in a single battle. But Dorne was slipping through his fingers like sand, and there was nothing he could do about it. He tried different strategies. He sent riders to Sunspear, demanding that Meria Martell come forth and face him. She did not answer. He offered pardons to any Dornish lord who would bend the knee. None came forward. He threatened to burn every village, every farm, every olive grove in Dorne, until nothing was left but ash. The Dornish did not care. They had already abandoned those places. Rhaenys flew further south, deeper into the desert, searching for the Dornish forces she was sure must be hiding somewhere. Meraxes was smaller and faster than Balerion, better suited for long flights over hostile terrain. She scoured the wadis and canyons, the dry riverbeds and the rocky wastes, looking for camps or supply depots or anything that would tell her where the Dornish had gone. She found almost nothing. A few scattered groups of refugees, too old or too young to fight, hiding in caves, empty villages, their wells filled with sand to deny them to the invaders. Once she saw a column of Dornish riders in the distance, but by the time Meraxes reached the spot, they were gone, swallowed by the desert as if they had never existed. It was exhausting. It was infuriating. And it was draining the Targaryen forces more than any battle could have. The men Aegon had brought with him, soldiers from the Crownlands and the Stormlands, loyal bannermen who had followed him through the conquest, were suffering. The heat was unbearable for men used to the cooler climates of the north. Water was scarce, food even more so. The Dornish had stripped the land bare before they left, taking or hiding anything that could sustain an army. The Targaryens had to bring in supplies from the north, long wagon trains that crawled through the mountain passes and were constantly harassed by Dornish raiders. Men began to desert. Some died of heatstroke or thirst. Others simply walked away in the night, deciding that Dorne was not worth dying for. Morale plummeted. The soldiers did not understand what they were fighting for anymore. There was no enemy to kill, no castle to take, no victory to celebrate, Just endless marching through hostile terrain, watching for ambushes that could come from any direction. And the Dornish kept bleeding them. A patrol would ride out in the morning and not return. A camp would wake to find half their horses gone, their guards dead, and no sign of who had done it. Officers would receive messages written in Dornish, mocking them, telling them to go home. "You can burn our castles," one message said, "but you cannot burn the sun, you cannot burn the sand, and you cannot burn us, because you will never find us." Aegon realized he was fighting a war he could not win. Not like this. Not by flying overhead and burning empty buildings. He needed to draw the Dornish out, force them to fight, give him something to actually defeat. But how do you force an enemy to fight when they refuse to do so? How do you conquer people who would rather live in caves and tents than submit? He did not have an answer. Visenya suggested a different approach. If they could not defeat the Dornish in the field, they should target the leadership. Kill or capture Princess Meria, and perhaps Dorne would lose its will to resist. It was not a bad plan. Meria was old, blind, and likely still in Sunspear. One swift strike with all 3 dragons could end the war in a single morning. But Sunspear was not easy to reach. It sat on the coast, surrounded by water on 3 sides, and desert on the 4th. An army approaching overland would be spotted days in advance, giving Meria time to flee or prepare defences. A naval assault was possible, but the Targaryens did not have a strong fleet, and the waters around Sunspear were treacherous, full of reefs and shifting sandbars. Still, it was worth trying. Aegon gathered his remaining forces and marched towards Sunspear. The journey took weeks, through hostile territory, harassed every step of the way. By the time they reached the city, they had lost hundreds of men to ambushes, disease, and desertion. And when they arrived, Sunspear was ready. The walls were manned. Scorpions, massive crossbows designed to kill dragons, lined the battlements, their bolts as long as spears and tipped with iron. The Dornish had learned from watching the Targaryens fight. They knew that dragons were not invincible. At Harrenhal, at the Field of Fire, dragons had flown high and burned from above, beyond the reach of arrows. But if a dragon flew low, if it came close enough to attack walls or men on the ground, it could be hit. And the Dornish were very, very good with spears. Aegon did not attack immediately. He circled the city on Balerion, studying the defences, looking for weaknesses. Visenya and Rhaenys did the same. But the longer they waited, the more time the Dornish had to prepare, and the more Aegon's army suffered in the desert heat, camped outside a city they could not easily take. Days passed, then weeks. The siege, if it could be called that, dragged on. The Targaryens could not starve out Sunspear. The city had access to the sea and could be resupplied by ship. They could not burn it without flying low, and flying low meant risking the scorpions. They could not assault the walls without taking horrific casualties. It was a stalemate, and stalemates favoured the defender. Meria Martell, blind and ancient, sat in her tower and waited. She did not need to win. She only needed to not lose. Time was on her side. Every day the Targaryens spent in Dorne was a day their strength diminished. Every week they stayed was another week for disease and desertion to thin their ranks. She could wait. She could outlast them. And she did. After months of fruitless campaigning, after burning half of Dorne and achieving nothing, Aegon made the decision to withdraw. He couldn't conquer Dorne. Not like this. not without losing more than he would gain. He had already spent a fortune on this war, lost thousands of men, and gained nothing but ashes and frustration. He would try again later, he told himself. He would find another way. But for now, he had to admit defeat. The dragons flew north, back over the Red Mountains, back to the lands where Aegon's rule was not questioned. Behind them, Dorne remained free. The castles were burned, yes. The land was scarred, but the people were alive, and they had not bent the knee. Meria Martell's message had been delivered, and the Targaryens had learned it well. You may burn us, but you will not bend us. The war was not over. It would flare up again and again over the years, a running sore on the edge of Aegon's realm. But the first campaign, the one that was supposed to bring Dorne to heel in a matter of weeks, had failed utterly. Dorne had proven that even dragons could be defied, and the cost of that lesson was still to come. The war did not end when Aegon withdrew. It could not end, because neither side would accept the terms the other demanded. Aegon insisted that Dorne must bend the knee and become part of his 7 kingdoms. Meria Martell insisted that Dorne would remain free, no matter the cost. Between these two absolutes, there could be no peace, only more bloodshed. The fighting continued, but it changed. The initial Targaryen campaign had been a concentrated effort, all 3 dragons focused on breaking Dorne through overwhelming force. When that failed, the war became something smaller, but no less vicious. Raids and counter-raids, ambushes along the mountain passes, Dornish spearmen crossing the border into the Reach or the Stormlands, burning villages and stealing cattle before melting back into the desert. Targaryen forces, responding with their own raids, supported occasionally by dragonfire when Aegon or his sisters had the time and patience to fly south again. It became a war of attrition, a bleeding wound that neither side could close. The Reach and the Stormlands suffered the most. Their lands bordered Dorne, and they bore the brunt of the Dornish raids. Lords along the border fortified their castles, built watchtowers, and kept their garrisons on constant alert. But it was never enough. The Dornish were too fast, too unpredictable. They struck where they were least expected, did their damage, and vanished before help could arrive. The common people paid the heaviest price, as they always do. Farmers saw their fields burned, their livestock stolen or slaughtered. Villages were raided in the night, their people killed or carried off as hostages. Trade routes became dangerous, travellers disappeared, and the border regions turned into a lawless wasteland where only the desperate or the foolish dared to live. For Aegon, this was intolerable. He had not conquered 6 kingdoms, only to see his realm bleed along its southern edge. He needed to end this war, decisively and permanently. But how? Another invasion would likely end the same way as the first. Castles burned, land scorched, and the Dornish still undefeated, still hiding in their mountains and deserts. Visenya urged a harsher approach. Burn everything, she said. Do not just destroy the castles, destroy the farms, the olive groves, the wells and water sources. Make Dorne uninhabitable, a wasteland of ash and bone where nothing could grow and no one could live. Force the Dornish to submit or die of starvation. But Aegon hesitated. Such brutality would turn the other kingdoms against him. It would make him a tyrant, not a king. And it would not necessarily work. The Dornish had already proven they could survive in conditions that would break other peoples. They might simply retreat further into the desert. into places even dragons could not reach, and wait for the Targaryens to give up. Rhaenys suggested a different strategy. She believed the key was not in burning Dorne to ashes, but in breaking its will to resist. If they could kill or capture the Dornish leadership, Princess Meria and the lords who supported her, the common people might lose heart and accept Targaryen rule. It was a more surgical approach, targeting the head of the snake, rather than burning the entire body. Aegon agreed. And so Rhaenys took Meraxes and flew south once more, searching for high-value targets. She would hunt the Dornish lords in their hiding places, destroy their supply caches, disrupt their communications. She would show them that nowhere in Dorne was safe from dragonfire. It was during one of these raids that everything changed. The castle known as the Hellholt sat in the deep desert, far from the coast and the mountain passes. It was not a large or particularly important fortress, held by House Ula, a relatively minor house even by Dornish standards. But it had become a staging point for Dornish raiders, a place where they gathered before striking north into the Reach. Rhaenys had received reports that a significant force was gathering there, possibly preparing for a major raid. She decided to strike before they could move. Rhaenys flew to the Hellholt with a small force of soldiers, enough to hold the ground after the dragon did its work, but not so many that they would slow her down. She approached in the afternoon when the sun was at its highest and the heat shimmered off the sands like a living thing. From above, the Hellholt looked like a dark smudge against the endless red and gold of the desert, its walls low and thick, built to withstand heat and sandstorms rather than sieges. There were men on the walls. She could see them moving, tiny figures scurrying like ants. Good. That meant they were there, that this was not another empty castle. She would burn them in their own fortress and send a message to every other Dornish lord. Nowhere is safe. Meraxes descended, her silver scales flashing in the sunlight. Rhaenys could feel the dragon's eagerness, the anticipation of flame and destruction. They had done this dozens of times before. It should have been simple, but the Dornish were waiting. As Meraxes swooped low, preparing to bathe the castle in fire, the scorpions appeared. Not one or two, but dozens of them, hidden beneath canvas covers that blended with the stone. They had been concealed until the last possible moment, waiting for the dragon to come within range. The Dornish loosed their bolts. A scorpion bolt is not like an arrow. It is as long as a spear, as thick as a man's wrist, tipped with iron, and designed to punch through armor or ships' hulls. When fired from a powerful enough engine, it can pierce dragon scale. If the shot is lucky, if the angle is right, if the dragon is close enough. Meraxes was close enough. The first bolt struck her wing, tearing through the membrane and sending the dragon into a sudden, uncontrolled spin. Rhaenys held on, her hands gripping the saddle, her voice shouting commands that the dragon could not obey. More bolts flew. One struck Meraxes in the side, glancing off the thick scales, but causing enough pain to make the dragon roar in fury and agony. And then one bolt found its mark. It struck Meraxes in the eye, the one place where a dragon's scales do not protect it. The great beast screamed, a sound like tearing metal, and plummeted from the sky. Rhaenys tried to control the fall, tried to turn the dive into a landing, but it was too late. Meraxes crashed into the sands outside the Hellholt, with a force that shook the ground, her body convulsing, her wings thrashing uselessly. Rhaenys was thrown from the saddle. She hit the sand hard, the impact driving the breath from her lungs. For a moment she lay there stunned, the world spinning around her. Then she forced herself to move, to stand, to draw her sword. The Dornish were already coming. They poured out of the Hellholt like a swarm, warriors in light armour carrying spears and curved blades. They knew what they had done. They knew they had just killed a dragon, just brought down one of the Conqueror's own sisters. This was their chance to end the war in a single stroke. Rhaenys fought. She was a Targaryen, a dragon rider, trained in combat from childhood. She cut down the first man who reached her, then the second. But there were too many. They surrounded her, pressing in from all sides, their spears darting in like striking snakes. The soldiers who had accompanied her tried to reach her, tried to fight their way through the Dornish ranks. Some succeeded. Most did not. The battle was chaos, a swirling melee in the shadow of a dying dragon. What happened next is unclear. The histories do not agree, because there were few survivors, and those who did survive told different stories. Some say Rhaenys was killed in the fighting, cut down by Dornish spears. Others claim she was captured alive, taken into the Hellholt, and tortured for days before she finally died. Still others whisper that she survived her wounds, but was buried alive in the sands, left to die of thirst and heat beneath the merciless Dornish sun. The Ullars, who held the Hellholt, never said, and the Targaryens never found out for certain. All they knew was that Rhaenys Targaryen did not return, and neither did Meraxes. When word reached Aegon, he did not believe it at first. Rhaenys was his sister, his wife, his partner in conquest. She had been with him since before they came to Westeros, had fought beside him through every battle, had helped him forge the Iron Throne from the swords of the defeated. She could not be dead. Not her. Not like this. But she was. The grief that struck Aegon was terrible to behold. Those who saw him in the days after the news arrived said he aged 10 years in as many hours. The man who had conquered 6 kingdoms, who had built a dynasty on fire and blood, wept like a broken child. And when the tears stopped, what replaced them was far worse. Rage. Aegon took Balerion and flew to Dorne. Not with an army, not with a plan, just himself and his dragon and his fury. He found the Hellholt and burned it. Not just burned it, he turned it into a crater of molten stone and blackened sand. The castle melted. The walls ran like wax. Every living thing within a mile of the fortress died, scorched to ash by dragonfire so intense that the sand itself turned to glass. But it was not enough. It would never be enough. Aegon burned the lands around the Hellholt for miles in every direction. He burned villages that had nothing to do with Rhaenys' death. He burned farms and fields and olive groves. He turned the desert into an even more hostile wasteland, a place where nothing lived and nothing grew. And when he was done, he returned north and gave orders to his other lords. Dorne was to be punished, raided without mercy. Every Dornish man, woman, and child who crossed the border was to be killed on sight. No prisoners, no quarter, no negotiations. The war that had been brutal before became something worse. The Dornish retaliated with their own atrocities. Prisoners were tortured and mutilated before being sent back north. Villages in the Reach weren't just raided, but massacred. Everyone killed, their bodies left to rot in the sun as a warning. The Bone Way earned a new name, the Blood Way, because so many men died there, both Dornish and Targaryen forces, that the stones were said to run red with blood after every battle. It became a war without honour, without mercy, without end. Both sides committed horrors that would be remembered for generations. And through it all, Dorne did not bend. Princess Meria Martell, who had started this war with her refusal to kneel, lived to see the death of Rhaenys Targaryen. Some say she smiled when she heard the news, though being blind, she couldn't see the messenger's face. Others say she wept, knowing what vengeance the Targaryens would exact for their loss. Either way, she remained defiant. "One dragon down," she said to have remarked, "two to go." But Meria herself would not live to see the end of the war. She was too old, too frail, worn down by years of conflict and the burden of leadership. She died in her sleep, in Sunspear, with Dorne still free and still fighting. Her son took up her crown and her cause, and the war continued, without pause. Aegon never recovered from Rhaenys' death. He continued to rule, continued to fight, but something inside him had broken. The man who had united 6 kingdoms could not conquer the 7th, and the cost of trying had taken one of the people he loved most in the world. Years passed. The war became a constant feature of life in Westeros, a running sore that drained resources and lives but never healed. Aegon grew old. Visenya grew old. The Dornish who had fought in the early days died, and were replaced by their children, who had known nothing but war their entire lives. And still, Dorne did not bend. The lesson was clear. Written in blood and ash across the red sands, dragons could be killed. Dragon riders could die. And a people who refused to surrender, who were willing to endure any hardship, any loss, any suffering rather than kneel, such a people could not be conquered. Not by fire, not by blood, not by dragons. Rhaenys' death was the turning point. It proved that the Targaryens were not invincible. It showed that Dorne could fight back, could hurt them, could make them bleed, and it ensured that the war would continue, year after year, generation after generation, until one side or the other found a different way to end it. But that would not happen for a long, long time. The war did not end with Rhaenys' death. It did not end with Meria Martell's death either, though she passed from the world a few years later, blind and ancient, but unbowed to the last. The war simply continued, grinding on year after year, becoming not a dramatic conflict, but a permanent feature of life along the southern border of the 7 kingdoms. This is what happens when neither side can win, but neither side will surrender. The fighting becomes routine, normalized, woven into the fabric of everyday existence. Children grew up knowing no other reality. Old men couldn't remember a time before the Dornish Wars. And still, the killing continued. Aegon lived for another decade after Rhaenys fell. He flew to Dorne several more times on Balerion, burning castles and scorching the earth. But he never achieved what he wanted. The Dornish rebuilt what he destroyed. They replaced their losses. They adapted to his tactics. Every raid he launched was met with counter-raids into the Reach and the Stormlands. Every castle he burned was avenged tenfold by Dornish spears in the night. When Aegon finally died, of natural causes, in his bed, the first Targaryen king to do so, Dorne remained unconquered. His son Aenys inherited the throne and inherited the war. Then Aenys died, and his half-brother Maegor the Cruel took the crown. Maegor was even more brutal than Aegon had been, more willing to use terror and cruelty as weapons. He tortured Dornish prisoners, executed entire villages suspected of aiding raiders, and offered gold for Dornish heads. It changed nothing. Dorne did not break. Dorne did not bend. Maegor died, murdered most likely, though the details remain murky, and was succeeded by Jaehaerys, who would later be called the Conciliator. Jaehaerys was wise, patient, more interested in building than burning. He tried diplomacy with Dorne, sending envoys with offers of peace, marriage alliances, and mutual recognition. The Dornish refused. They would not negotiate from a position of weakness, would not acknowledge Targaryen authority in any form. And so, the war continued. But it was no longer the war it had been in Aegon's time. There were no more large-scale invasions, no more attempts to conquer Dorne outright. Both sides had learned that such efforts were futile. Instead, the conflict settled into a pattern of raids and reprisals, a low-intensity struggle that cost lives and gold, but never reached a conclusion. The Dornish marches, the borderlands between Dorne and the rest of Westeros, became a place apart, a region defined by violence. The lords who held castles there were hard men, made harder by constant warfare. They lived in a state of perpetual alertness, knowing that any night could bring Dornish raiders over the walls. The people were armed, trained to fight, accustomed to bloodshed. House Caron of Nightsong, House Dondarrion of Blackhaven, House Swan of Stonehelm. These and other Marcher lords bore the brunt of the Dornish threat. They fortified their castles, built watchtowers along the passes, and kept their men ready to ride at a moment's notice. They also raided into Dorne when they could, crossing the border to burn and kill and take what plunder they could find before retreating back to their own lands. It became a way of life. A man might spend his entire existence fighting the Dornish, killing them and being killed by them, without ever understanding why the war had started or what it was supposed to achieve. The reasons no longer mattered. The war simply was, and men fought it, because that was what their fathers had done, and what their sons would do after them. The Reach suffered almost as much as the Stormlands. The Dornish could cross the Prince's Pass into the domains of House Tyrell, raiding the farms and villages of the western marches. Lords like House Peak and House Rowan kept their own garrisons strong, their own defences prepared, but they could not be everywhere at once. The Dornish struck where they were weak and disappeared before help arrived. Trade suffered. The rich farmlands of the Reach produced grain and fruit and wine, but getting those goods to market became dangerous when Dornish raiders prowled the roads. Merchants demanded armed escorts. Prices rose. The common people, who had no say in the war and no stake in its outcome, paid for it with hunger and fear. And what did the Iron Throne gain from all this? Nothing. Dorne remained independent, its rulers still calling themselves princes and princesses, still refusing to acknowledge the Targaryen kings in King's Landing. The Dornish did not raid for conquest or territory. They raided for vengeance, for plunder, and to remind the Targaryens that the war was not over, and wouldn't be over until Dorne was left in peace. The dragons made fewer and fewer appearances as the years went on. Balerion grew old and sluggish, too tired to fly south and burn castles anymore. Vega remained dangerous, but Visenya had no interest in wasting her time on a war that could not be won. The younger dragons, those born after the conquest, were not yet large enough to be weapons of war. And even if they had been, what would they have accomplished? The Dornish had proven that dragons could be killed. They had scorpions and tactics designed to bring down flying beasts. Sending dragons to Dorne was no longer a guarantee of victory. It was a risk. So the war became a war of men, not dragons. And men die just as easily as dragons, sometimes more so. The cost mounted on both sides. Thousands of soldiers dead. Tens of thousands of common folk killed in raids or dying of starvation when their farms were burned. Entire villages depopulated, castles destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. The wealth that could have been spent on roads, on harbours, on building a stronger realm, all of it poured into a war that achieved nothing. King Jaehaerys tried again and again to negotiate peace. He was a practical man, not driven by the same pride that had consumed his grandfather Aegon. He understood that Dorne was not worth the cost. Let them keep their independence, he thought, as long as they stopped raiding and acknowledged some form of Targaryen overlordship, even if only in name. But the Dornish would not accept even that. They insisted on full independence, no concessions, no compromises. They had paid for their freedom in blood and ash, and they would not surrender it for words on parchment. Every time Jaehaerys sent an envoy, the Dornish sent him back with the same answer. Leave us alone, and we will leave you alone. Try to conquer us, and we will bleed you forever. It was an impasse with no solution. The small folk on both sides grew weary of the war, but the small folk have no voice in such matters. The lords and princes who commanded armies and made decisions were too proud to back down, too invested in the conflict to let it go. And so it continued. There were moments when peace seemed possible. Truces were declared, sometimes lasting months, or even years. Prisoners were exchanged. Marriages were proposed between Dornish houses and houses of the Reach or Stormlands, small attempts to build bridges across the blood-soaked divide. Some of these marriages even happened, creating fragile ties of kinship that might one day lead to lasting peace. But then a raid would break the truce. A Dornish village would be burned, or a Marcher lord would be killed in an ambush, and the cycle of vengeance would begin again. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild, and the trust between Dorne and the Iron Throne had been shattered long ago. King Jaehaerys ruled for 55 years, the longest reign of any Targaryen king. He accomplished great things. He built roads, codified laws, settled disputes between the great houses, and brought prosperity to much of the realm. But he never solved the problem of Dorne. When he died, the war was still going on, just as it had been when he took the throne. His grandson Viserys inherited the crown and inherited the war. Viserys was a weak king, more interested in pageantry and pleasure than in governance. He had no interest in fighting Dorne, and no idea how to make peace with them. So he ignored the problem, letting the Marcher lords handle the fighting while he enjoyed tournaments and feasts in King's Landing. The war became background noise, a constant drone of violence that no one really paid attention to unless it flared up into something dramatic. And for decades, it did not. The raids continued, the reprisals continued. People died, and the world moved on. Then Viserys died, and his son, Aegon II, took the throne. But Aegon's reign was consumed by a different war, the civil war known as the Dance of the Dragons, when Targaryen fought Targaryen for the Iron Throne. Dorne stayed out of that conflict, watching with quiet satisfaction as the Dragon Lords tore themselves apart. By the time the dance was over, the dragons were nearly extinct. the Targaryen dynasty weakened and the realm fractured, and still Dorne remained free. Generations had passed since Aegon the Conqueror demanded that Meria Martell bend the knee. Most of the people who remembered the beginning of the war were dead. New kings, new princes, new lords had taken their places, but the fundamental reality had not changed. Dorne would not submit. The Iron Throne would not give up. And the war ground on, decade after decade, a wound that would not heal. The Marcher lords grew rich from plunder and poor from constant warfare. Their castles were strong, but their lands were scarred. They buried fathers and sons and brothers, raised new generations to hate the Dornish, and taught their children the same lessons of vengeance and survival. The Dornish, for their part, remained unified in their defiance. The lords might squabble among themselves, as lords always do, but when it came to the Targaryens, they spoke with one voice. No. They would not bend. They would not kneel. They would endure whatever suffering was necessary to remain free. And they did endure. The deserts and mountains that made Dorne so hard to conquer also made it hard to destroy. The Dornish adapted to scarcity, to hardship, to living on the edge. They rebuilt their burned villages. They replanted their scorched fields. They survived. By the time King Daeron I came to the throne, Daeron, the young dragon, bold and brilliant, and utterly convinced he could succeed where all his ancestors had failed. The war had been going on for more than a century. It had outlasted the Conqueror himself, outlasted the dragon's supremacy, outlasted the memory of why it had even started. But it had not ended. And now, a new king with new ambitions was about to test Dorne once more, to see if youth and genius could accomplish what age and experience had not. He would learn the same lesson his forebears had learned. But he would learn it the hard way, in blood and sand and bitter, bitter defeat. The stalemate was about to break, and Dorne was ready. Daeron Targaryen was 14 years old when he became king. 14, and already he dreamed of glory. He was called the Young Dragon, and the name fit him well. He was bold, where his father had been cautious, ambitious, where others were content, hungry for the kind of fame that would make the singers remember his name forever. He had read the histories, studied the maps, learned the lessons of every battle ever fought in Westeros. And he had come to a conclusion that no one else seemed willing to accept. Dorne could be conquered. It had never been done because no one had tried hard enough, planned well enough, or been brave enough to see it through. Daeron believed he was different. He believed he could succeed where Aegon the Conqueror had failed. His lords counselled caution. The wars with Dorne had been going on for over a century, they reminded him. Thousands had died, fortunes had been spent, and nothing had been gained. The Dornish were too stubborn, too clever, too willing to endure suffering rather than submit. "Leave them alone," the old lords said. "Let the Marcher lords handle the raids and the border skirmishes. There are better uses for the crown's resources." But Daeron did not want to hear about caution or compromise. He wanted conquest. He wanted to be the king who finally brought Dorne into the realm, who finished what his ancestor had started, who proved that the Targaryens were still the greatest dynasty in the world. So he began to plan. The mistake every previous Targaryen had made, Daeron believed, was in trying to burn Dorne into submission. Dragons were powerful, yes, but they could not hold territory. They could destroy, but they could not occupy. And the Dornish had proven time and again that they could survive destruction. They would simply scatter, hide, and return when the flames died down. Daren's plan was different. He would not rely on dragons. He would use armies, massive armies, well supplied and well led, capable of occupying the land and holding it. He would take and garrison every major castle in Dorne, cut off the routes the Dornish used to retreat into the mountains and deserts, and force them to either surrender or starve. It was, on parchment, a brilliant strategy. Daeron had studied the terrain, understood the logistics, identified the key strong points that needed to be taken. He planned his invasion with the precision of a master tactician, dividing his forces into multiple columns that would advance from different directions, surrounding the Dornish and giving them nowhere to run. He gathered the largest army Westeros had seen since the days of Aegon's conquest. 50,000 men, some said. Others claimed it was more. They came from every corner of the realm, knights from the Reach in gleaming armour, Stormlanders hungry for vengeance against their old enemies, Riverlanders and Westermen, and even some Northerners, all united under the dragon banner. Daeron led them south himself. He was young, but he was no coward. He rode at the head of his army, his presence inspiring the men, his confidence infectious. They believed in him. They believed that this time, finally, Dorne would fall. The invasion began in the summer. It was a calculated choice. Summer meant better weather, easier marching conditions, and longer days for fighting. Daeron's armies poured through the Prince's Pass and the Boneway simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to split the Dornish defences and prevent them from concentrating their forces. And at first, it worked. The Dornish were caught off guard by the scale and speed of the invasion. They had expected raids, perhaps a punitive expedition, but not a full-scale conquest, backed by the entire strength of the Iron Throne. Their scattered forces tried to resist, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Daeron's armies swept across Dorne like a storm. Castle after castle fell. Some surrendered without a fight, their lords calculating that resistance was futile. Others held out briefly before being overwhelmed. The Targaryen banners were raised over Ironwood, over Skyreach, over God's Grace and Vaith and the Tor. Within a few months, Daeron had accomplished what no Targaryen before him had managed. He had conquered Dorne. Every major castle was in his hands. Every Dornish lord of significance had either bent the knee or been captured. The Prince of Dorne himself, the latest in the line of Martell rulers who had defied the Iron Throne for generations, submitted in Sunspear and swore fealty to the boy king. Daeron returned to King's Landing in triumph. The singers composed songs about the young dragon who had succeeded where even the Conqueror failed. Small folk lined the streets to cheer him. Lords who had doubted him now praised his genius. At 14 years old, Daeron had become a legend, but the singers stopped singing soon enough, because Dorne had not been conquered. Not really. The castles had been taken, yes. The lords had bent the knee, yes. But the Dornish people, the thousands upon thousands of common folk who lived in the deserts and mountains, who remembered a century of resistance, who had been raised on stories of Meria Martell's defiance. They had not surrendered. They had simply gone quiet, waiting for their moment. Daeron left garrisons in every castle he had taken. Thousands of men spread across Dorne, tasked with holding the conquered territory and keeping the peace. They were good soldiers, loyal and disciplined. But they were strangers in a hostile land. They did not speak the language most common Dornish used among themselves. They did not understand the customs, the religion, the unspoken rules that governed life in the desert. They were occupiers, and the Dornish treated them as such. The resistance began slowly. A patrol that went out and never came back. A supply wagon that was ambushed on a lonely road. A well that was poisoned, sickening an entire garrison. At first, these incidents seemed random, isolated. The garrison commanders reported them as banditry, the kind of lawlessness that happens in any newly conquered land. But it was not random. It was coordinated, deliberate, and it was everywhere. The Dornish lords who had bent the knee were playing a double game. In public, they proclaimed their loyalty to King Daeron. In private, they supported the resistance, funneling weapons and supplies to the fighters in the hills, providing intelligence about Targaryen troop movements, and quietly encouraging their people to make life as difficult as possible for the occupiers. The common folk needed no encouragement. They hated the Targaryens with a passion born of a century of war. They remembered the burnings, the raids, the death of Rhaenys, and the vengeance that followed. They remembered Meria Martell's words, "You may burn us, but you will not bend us," and they took them to heart. So they fought. Not in open battle, because that would be suicide. They fought the way their ancestors had fought, the way Dorne had always fought. Ambushes, assassinations, sabotage. They struck at night when the garrisons were sleeping, killing sentries and disappearing into the darkness. They set fires. They stole horses. They murdered officers and left their bodies in the street as a warning. The Targaryen soldiers began to die, not in dramatic battles, but in ones and twos, a steady drip of casualties that never stopped. A man would step into an alley and be stabbed. A patrol would ride through a canyon and be caught in a rock slide. A commander would drink poisoned wine at a feast held in his honor by a smiling Dornish lord. The garrisons tried to respond with force. They arrested suspects, interrogated prisoners, executed those they believed were involved in the resistance. But it did not help. For every rebel they killed, 2 more appeared. The Dornish population was not going to betray their own people to foreign occupiers, no matter how much pressure was applied. And the occupiers were strangers, easy to identify, impossible to blend in. They could not tell the difference between a loyal subject and a hidden enemy. Everyone smiled at them during the day and might stab them at night. Every Dornish servant could be a spy. Every merchant could be funneling supplies to the resistance. Every child playing in the street could be carrying a message. Paranoia set in. The soldiers stopped trusting anyone. They stayed in their castles, venturing out only in large, heavily armed groups. But that made them predictable, and the Dornish exploited that predictability. Ambushes became routine. Supply lines were constantly harassed. The cost of holding Dorne grew higher and higher. Daeron heard the reports and refused to believe them at first. His conquest had been so swift, so complete. How could it be falling apart? He sent more troops, more supplies, more stern warnings to the Dornish lords to keep their people in line. But it was like trying to hold water in his hands. The harder he squeezed, the more slipped through his fingers. Then the situation got worse. The lords who had bent the knee began to rebel openly. They had been biding their time, waiting for the right moment, and now they saw it. The Targaryen garrisons were weakened, demoralized, and spread too thin. if the Dornish struck now, struck hard, and in coordination, they could drive the occupiers out. And that is exactly what they did. Castles that had surrendered rose in revolt. Garrisons were overwhelmed, their soldiers slaughtered. The lords who had sworn fealty to Daeron renounced their oaths and declared for Dorne's independence once more. What had been a low-intensity insurgency became a full-scale uprising. Daeron, realizing his conquest was collapsing, gathered another army and marched south to restore order. He was still confident, still certain that he could crush the rebellion and reassert control. He had done it once. He could do it again. But this time the Dornish were ready for him. He reached Dorne and found himself fighting a war on 100 fronts. Every village was hostile. Every pass was a potential ambush. His supply lines were constantly under attack. His scouts were picked off before they could report, and his commanders were assassinated in their own camps. Daeron tried to bring the Dornish to battle, to force them into the kind of open engagement where his superior numbers and discipline would give him the advantage. But the Dornish refused. They fought the way they had always fought. Hit and run, strike and fade, bleed the enemy slowly rather than face them directly. It was the first Dornish War all over again, but worse. Because now the Dornish were not just defending their land. They were fighting to drive out an occupier, and they fought with the fury of people who had tasted freedom and refused to give it up. Daeron's army began to fall apart. Desertions increased. Supplies ran low. Disease spread through the camps. Men who had marched south full of confidence and dreams of glory now just wanted to go home, to leave this cursed desert and never return. And then, in the chaos and confusion of a war that could not be won, King Daeron I Targaryen died. The details are murky, lost in the fog of war and the lies that always follow. Some say he was killed in an ambush, struck down by a Dornish spear. Others claim he was assassinated, poisoned by a traitor in his own camp. Still others whisper that he died of fever, weakened by the heat and stress and the weight of his failure. However it happened, the result was the same. The young dragon was dead, killed in Dorne, his conquest turned to ash. He had ruled for less than 4 years. His great triumph had lasted less than 1. The army retreated north, broken and demoralized, leaving behind the bodies of thousands of soldiers and the wreckage of Daeron's ambitions. The Dornish reclaimed their castles, tore down the Targaryen banners, and declared their independence restored. 50,000 men had marched into Dorne. Fewer than half returned. The cost in gold was staggering, the cost in lives was catastrophic, and the cost in pride, the realization that even the most brilliant Targaryen king could not conquer Dorne, was perhaps highest of all. Daeron's conquest had proven nothing except what the Dornish already knew. They could not be held by force. You could take their castles, but you could not keep them. You could make them kneel, but you could not make them stay kneeling. And if you tried, they would bleed you until you had nothing left to give. The young dragon's folly became a lesson that would be remembered for generations. Dorne was unconquerable, not because they were stronger or richer or more numerous, but because they refused to lose. And that refusal, that stubborn, unyielding defiance, was a weapon more powerful than any army. The war would continue. But after Daeron, no Targaryen would ever try to conquer Dorne by force again. They would have to find another way. When Daeron died in Dorne, his brother Baelor, inherited the throne and the disaster his brother had created. Baelor was 17 years old, pious to the point of obsession, gentle where Daron had been bold, and utterly opposed to the continuation of the war. Where his brother had dreamed of conquest and glory, Baelor dreamed of peace and redemption. They called him Baelor the Blessed, and if ever a king deserved such a name, it was him. He was devout beyond measure, spending hours in prayer, fasting until he grew weak, giving away the crown's wealth to the poor and the holy. He read the 7-pointed star constantly and tried to live by its teachings of mercy, forgiveness, and compassion. To Baelor, war was sin, and the war with Dorne was the greatest sin of all. He was also, it must be said, perhaps not entirely sound of mind. His piety bordered on madness. He saw visions, heard the voices of the gods, and made decisions that baffled his counselors and terrified his court. But in one thing, at least, his instincts were correct. The war with Dorne had to end. And it had to end not with more bloodshed, but with peace. The first thing Baelor did as king was to order the immediate withdrawal of all Targaryen forces from Dorne. The lords protested. They wanted revenge for Daeron's death, wanted to punish the Dornish for their rebellion. But Baelor would not hear it. Every day the army remained in Dorne, more men died. Every day the war continued, more souls were damned. He commanded the withdrawal, and the army obeyed, though many did so grudgingly. The retreat was difficult and costly. The Dornish harassed the withdrawing forces every step of the way, killing stragglers and picking off the wounded. By the time the last Targaryen soldiers crossed back into the Reach and the Stormlands, thousands more had died. But at least the occupation was over. At least the bleeding had stopped, for now. With the armies home, Baelor turned his attention to the larger problem: how to end the war permanently. He could not conquer Dorne. His brother had proven that was impossible. He could not ignore Dorne. The raids and counter-raids would continue as they had for over a century. The only option left was negotiation, and negotiation required something the Targaryens had never been willing to offer: compromise. Baelor's counselors advised him to send envoys to open talks with Prince Meria Martell, the current ruler of Dorne. But Baelor had a different idea, one that shocked everyone who heard it. He would not send envoys. He would go himself. He, the king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, would walk into Dorne alone and unarmed, and he would make peace. The court thought he was mad. The High Septon begged him to reconsider. His hand warned him that the Dornish would kill him, that walking into Dorne was suicide, that no treaty was worth the king's life. But Baelor couldn't be dissuaded. He believed that the gods would protect him. He believed that if he showed the Dornish his sincerity, his willingness to risk everything for peace, they would respond in kind. So Baelor set out for Dorne, not with an army, not with guards, not even with a retinue of servants. He walked barefoot, wearing nothing but simple robes, carrying nothing but a copy of the 7-pointed star. He took the Bone Way, the narrow pass through the Red Mountains that had seen so much bloodshed over the years. The journey nearly killed him. The Bone Way was called that for a reason. It was a treacherous route, filled with steep cliffs, narrow trails, and places where a single misstep meant a fatal fall. But it was also home to vipers, venomous snakes that nested in the rocks and struck at anyone who came too close. Baelor, walking barefoot through the pass, was bitten multiple times. Viper venom is agonizing and often deadly. Baelor collapsed, his body racked with pain and fever, barely able to move. He should have died there, alone on the rocky trail, another casualty of the endless war with Dorne. But somehow, by miracle or by sheer stubborn will, he survived. He crawled forward, dragging himself through the pass, praying for strength, until finally he emerged on the Dornish side. The Dornish found him there, more dead than alive, and brought him to Sunspear. They could have killed him. They could have held him hostage, demanded any ransom they wanted for the King of Westeros delivered into their hands. But they did not. Perhaps they were moved by his courage. Perhaps they were simply curious about what kind P12 of madman would walk unarmed into the land of his enemies. Or perhaps Prince Meria Martell saw an opportunity that was too valuable to waste. Baelor recovered slowly, tended by Dornish maesters, and nursed back to health in the very castle that had defied his ancestors for over a century. And when he was well enough to speak, he met with Prince Meria and began the negotiations that would change everything. Meria Martell was no fool. He understood that Dorne had won the war, not through military victory, but through endurance. The Targaryens had tried for over a century to conquer Dorne and failed. Daeron's invasion had been the last great attempt, and it had ended in disaster. The Iron Throne was exhausted, its treasury depleted, its people weary of a war that seemed to have no end. This was Dorne's moment to dictate terms, not to fight for survival. But Meria was also practical. Dorne had survived, yes, but at terrible cost. The land was scarred, the population reduced, the economy shattered by generations of warfare. The raids and counter-raids might continue indefinitely, but they would only impoverish both sides further. Peace, if it could be achieved on favourable terms, was worth pursuing. So Meria listened to what Baelor had to say. Baelor did not demand Dorne's submission. He did not threaten or bluster or try to impose terms from a position of strength he did not have. Instead, he offered something no Targaryen king had ever offered before, a genuine partnership. Dorne would enter the Seven Kingdoms, yes, but as equals. The Martells would keep their title of Prince and Princess, a distinction no other great house enjoyed. They would keep their laws, their customs, their right to govern themselves. They would not be conquered subjects, but willing allies. And to seal the alliance, Baelor proposed a marriage. His own cousin, a Targaryen princess, would marry Prince Meria's younger brother. Dornish blood would mingle with Targaryen blood, binding the two houses together in a way that swords and dragons never could. It was an extraordinary offer. It gave Dorne almost everything it had fought for. Independence in all but name, recognition of their unique status, and a place of honour in the realm rather than a position of subjugation. It was the kind of deal that could only be offered by a king who cared more about ending the war than about pride or tradition. Meria considered the offer carefully. He consulted with his lords, with his family, with the maesters and advisers who had guided Dorne through the long years of conflict. And in the end, he accepted. The treaty was signed in Sunspear, in the same hall where Meria Martell had once refused Aegon the Conqueror's demands. But this was a different time, a different offer, and a different outcome. Dorne would join the Seven Kingdoms. The Martells would swear fealty to the Iron Throne, but they would do so on their own terms, as partners rather than vassals. To ensure the peace held, hostages were exchanged. Dornish nobles would live at the Targaryen court in King's Landing, a guarantee of their good behaviour. Targaryen nobles would live in Sunspear, a guarantee that the Iron Throne would honour its promises. It was a common practice in Westeros, a way of ensuring that treaties were not broken lightly. The marriage was celebrated with great ceremony. The Targaryen princess travelled to Sunspear, and the wedding was held in the shadow of the Dornish sun, a union of fire and sand. It was more than just a marriage. It was a symbol of the new relationship between Dorne and the Iron Throne, a declaration that the old hatreds could be set aside, that peace was possible. When Baelor returned to King's Landing, he was hailed as a hero. The war that had consumed the realm for over a century was finally over. No more raids, no more burnings, no more young men dying in the Red Sands for a cause no one could remember. The singers composed new songs, praising Baelor's courage and wisdom, celebrating the peace he had achieved where so many others had failed. But not everyone was happy. The Marcher Lords, who had spent generations fighting the Dornish, felt betrayed. They had lost fathers and sons and brothers to Dornish spears, had seen their lands raided and burned, and now they were expected to simply forgive and forget. To accept the Dornish as allies, as equals? Many of them seethed with resentment, and that resentment would linger for years. The Dornish, for their part, were cautious. They had agreed to the treaty, yes, but they did not trust the Targaryens. Too much blood had been spilled, too many betrayals had occurred over the years. They would honour the agreement, but they would also remain vigilant, ready to defend themselves if the Iron Throne broke its word. Still, the treaty held. The hostages on both sides were treated well. The marriages produced children, and slowly, tentatively, the wounds began to heal. Trade resumed between Dorne and the rest of the realm. Dornish wine and Dornish silks became prized goods in King's Landing. Northern grain and rich gold flowed south. The roads that had once been battle lines became trade routes. It was not a perfect peace. There were still tensions, still mistrust, still moments when it seemed the old hatreds might flare up again. But it was peace, and that was more than anyone had dared hope for. Baelor didn't live long to see the fruits of his work. His extreme piety, his constant fasting and self-mortification weakened his body. He died young, worn out by his devotions and his efforts to be the most holy king Westeros had ever known. But his legacy endured. He had done what Aegon the Conqueror, what Maegor the Cruel, what Daeron the Young Dragon had all failed to do. He had brought Dorne into the realm, not with fire, not with blood, not with conquest, but with humility, with compromise, and with the recognition that some things cannot be taken by force. They can only be given freely. Prince Meria Martell, for his part, had achieved something remarkable as well. He had brought Dorne into the Seven Kingdoms without surrendering Dorne's independence. The Martells still ruled in Sunspear. Dornish laws still governed the Dornish people. The old customs, the old ways, the old pride. All of it remained intact. Dorne had bent, yes, but it had not been broken. And in bending on its own terms, it had won a victory greater than any it could have achieved on the battlefield. The treaty between Baelor and Marron became known as the Pact of Baelor, and it reshaped the political landscape of Westeros. For the first time in over a century, all seven kingdoms were truly united under one crown. There were no more independent realms, no more border wars, no more endless cycle of raid and reprisal. It was a fragile peace, built on compromise and mutual interest rather than conquest and domination. But it was peace nonetheless. And for a realm that had known nothing but war with Dorne for generations, that was a kind of miracle. The Dornish had proven, once and for all, that they could not be conquered. They had faced dragons and armies, had endured burnings and massacres, had lost castles and towns and countless lives. But they had never surrendered. And when peace finally came, it came because the Iron Throne acknowledged what the Dornish had always known. Dorne would never bend. It could only choose to join, and it would only do so as equals. Meria Martell's words, spoken so long ago to Aegon the Conqueror's messenger, had proven prophetic. You may burn us, but you will not bend us. The Targaryens had burned Dorne again and again for over 100 years, but they had not bent it. In the end, they had to offer peace on Dorne's terms, or accept that the war would never end. And so, after a century of blood and fire, the war was finally over. Dorne had entered the Seven Kingdoms, but it had done so unbowed, unbroken, and unyielding to the last. The peace that Baelor and Marin forged in Sunspear did not erase the past. It could not. The scars were too deep, the memories too bitter, the losses too great. Over a century of war had shaped both Dorne and the rest of Westeros in ways that would never fully heal. But the treaty held, and in holding, it proved something that armies and dragons never could, that Dorne had won. Not in the traditional sense of victory, perhaps. There were no defeated enemies kneeling in the throne room, no conquered territories added to Dornish lands, no plunder brought home to Sunspear. But Dorne had achieved what it set out to achieve from the very beginning. It had remained free. And when it finally joined the Seven Kingdoms, it did so on its own terms, as partners rather than subjects. This was the great lesson of the Dornish Wars, the truth that took the Targaryens more than 100 years to learn. Power is not always measured in swords and fire. Sometimes the greatest power lies in the ability to endure, to outlast, to refuse defeat, no matter the cost. The Dornish had that power in abundance, and it saved them when nothing else could. To understand why Dorne succeeded where every other kingdom failed, you have to look at what made them different. The other kingdoms that fell to Aegon the Conqueror fought the way kingdoms had always fought. They gathered their armies, met the enemy in the field, and tried to win through superior numbers or tactics or courage. When dragons came, they died bravely, but they died nonetheless. Their castles burned, their kings fell, and their people bent the knee because the alternative was annihilation. Dorne did not fight that way. From the very beginning, Meria Martell understood that you cannot defeat dragons by facing them directly. You cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy that can turn your entire army to ash in minutes. So Dorne chose a different path. The path of patience, of guerrilla warfare, of making themselves unconquerable, not through strength, but through resilience. They abandoned their castles when the dragons came. They let their lands burn rather than defend them in hopeless battles. They scattered into the deserts and mountains, places where dragons couldn't easily follow, and they waited. When the Targaryens tried to occupy their territory, the Dornish bled them slowly, ambush by ambush, poisoned well by poisoned well, until the cost of holding Dorne exceeded any possible benefit. It was not a glorious strategy. There were no heroic last stands, no legendary battles where a brave king faced down the dragon and died with honour. Instead, there was pragmatism, calculation, and a willingness to suffer in the short term to preserve freedom in the long term. It was the strategy of a people who valued their independence more than their pride, who understood that survival is more important than glory. And it worked. Against all odds, against the most powerful force in the known world, Dorne held out. They lost countless lives, saw their land devastated, endured hardships that would have broken most peoples. But they did not break. They bent sometimes when they had to. They negotiated when it served their interests. But they never surrendered, and they never stopped believing that they could outlast the dragons. The contrast with the other kingdoms is stark. The Reach had the largest army in Westeros, hundreds of thousands of men under the command of the Gardener Kings. They faced Aegon at the Field of Fire and were destroyed in a single afternoon. Their king and thousands of their best warriors turned to ash. The Reach submitted because the alternative was extinction. The Stormlands had Argilac the Arrogant, called the Storm King, a warrior of great renown. He challenged Aegon to single combat and died for his pride. His kingdom fell in a day. The North had Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt, who looked at what had happened to the southern kingdoms and made the calculation that resistance was futile. He bent the knee without a battle, preserving his people but surrendering his crown forever. All of these were rational choices given the circumstances. When faced with dragons, the smart thing to do is submit or die. But Dorne chose a third option: refuse to submit and refuse to die. Make yourself too difficult to conquer, too costly to hold, too stubborn to break. And if you can survive long enough, eventually your enemy will give up, or find a way to make peace. This strategy required something most kingdoms did not have: unity of purpose. Dorne's lords and common folk alike had to believe that independence was worth any price. They had to trust their leaders when those leaders told them to abandon their homes. They had to endure years of hardship, of living as refugees in their own land without losing faith in the cause. That unity came from Dorne's unique culture and history. The Dornish were not one people, but a mix. The Andals, who had invaded Westeros thousands of years ago, the first men who had been there before them, and the Rhoynar who had fled across the narrow sea from the dragon lords of Valyria. The Rhoynar especially had shaped Dornish culture, bringing customs and laws that set Dorne apart from the rest of Westeros. In Dorne, women could rule as easily as men. Daughters inherited alongside sons. A spear was valued as much as a sword. These were not just customs. They were expressions of a deeper truth about Dornish identity. Dorne was different, and the Dornish were proud of that difference. They did not want to be like the other kingdoms. They did not want to adopt the laws and ways of the Iron Throne. They wanted to remain themselves, distinct and independent. That cultural pride gave them the strength to endure. When Meria Martell said, "You may burn us, but you will not bend us," she was not just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every Dornishman and Dornish woman who valued their identity more than their comfort, who would rather die free than live as subjects. The Targaryens never understood this. They thought the Dornish resistance was about pride or stubbornness, or the personal ambitions of the Martell princes. They thought that if they could just inflict enough pain, impose enough suffering, the Dornish would eventually break. But the resistance was not about pride. It was about identity. It was about being Dornish. And the Dornish would not stop being Dornish, no matter how many castles burned. The death of Rhaenys Targaryen at the Hellholt should have taught Aegon this lesson. It proved that dragons could be killed, yes, but more importantly, it proved that the Dornish were willing to pay any price to remain free. They had killed a dragon and a queen, knowing full well that the vengeance would be terrible. And when that vengeance came, when Aegon burned half of Dorne in his grief and rage, the Dornish still did not surrender. That is the kind of enemy you cannot defeat. An enemy that will not break no matter what you do to them. An enemy that treats suffering as the price of freedom and pays it willingly. The Targaryens could have burned every castle in Dorne, killed every lord, scattered the population to the winds. But as long as one Dornishman remained alive and free, Dorne would not be conquered. Daeron the young dragon learned this lesson the hard way. His conquest of Dorne looked successful on the surface. Castles taken, lords submitting, the Targaryen banners flying over Sunspear. But it was an illusion. The Dornish had not truly submitted. They had simply bowed their heads and waited for their moment. And when that moment came, they rose up and drove out the occupiers, proving once again that Dorne could not be held by force. Daeron's mistake was thinking that conquest was the same as control. He took the castles, but he did not win the hearts and minds of the people. He occupied the land, but he did not understand it. He thought that because the lords had bent the knee, the war was over. But the war was never about the lords. It was about the people, and the people would never accept foreign rule. The insurgency that destroyed Daeron's occupation was not organized by the great houses or the princes in Sunspear. It came from below, from the common folk who picked up spears and knives and fought back in the only way they could. They killed soldiers in the dark, poisoned wells, ambushed patrols, and made every day of the occupation a nightmare for the Targaryen forces. They did not need grand strategies or brilliant generals. They just needed to be willing to fight and to keep fighting until the occupiers gave up and went home. This is the power of a people united in resistance. Armies can be defeated. Lords can be bought or intimidated. But a population that refuses to cooperate, that sees the occupiers as enemies rather than rulers, cannot be controlled. You can kill them, but you cannot rule them. And if you kill too many, you are left ruling over ashes and empty land, a hollow victory that costs more than it is worth. Baelor the Blessed understood what his predecessors did not. He understood that Dorne could not be conquered, and that trying to conquer it was destroying the realm. So he offered peace on terms that acknowledged Dorne's unique status, that gave the Dornish what they had been fighting for all along, the right to govern themselves, to keep their customs and laws, to remain Dornish. It was a wise decision, though it took a century of war to reach it. And in making that decision, Baelor gave Dorne a victory that no amount of military success could have achieved. Dorne entered the Seven Kingdoms, yes, but it did so as equals. The Martells kept their title of Prince and Princess, a mark of their special status. They kept their laws, their right to name their own heirs regardless of gender, their distinct identity. The treaty was a recognition that some things cannot be taken by force. Unity, loyalty, cultural identity. These cannot be imposed from above. They must be freely given, or they do not exist at all. By offering Dorne partnership instead of subjugation, Baelor created a foundation for real peace, a peace based on mutual respect rather than fear. The cost of the war on both sides was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers died from both Dorne and the armies of the Iron Throne. Countless civilians were killed in raids, burnings, and reprisals. Entire regions were depopulated, their people dead or scattered. The wealth that was spent on the war, the gold to outfit armies, the resources to maintain garrisons, the economic damage from disrupted trade, ran into fortunes that could have built roads, harbours, and cities. And for what? In the end, Dorne entered the realm on its own terms anyway. All those lives, all that wealth, all that suffering. It achieved nothing that could not have been accomplished through negotiation in the first place. The war was a waste, a monument to pride and stubbornness on both sides, a cautionary tale about the cost of refusing to compromise. But it was also, in a strange way, a testament to Dorne's greatness. They had faced the most powerful empire in the known world and refused to bow. They had endured suffering that would have broken any other people. They had lost battles, lost cities, lost entire generations, but they had not lost their freedom, and in the end, they had won. The legacy of the Dornish Wars shaped Westeros for centuries afterward. The Marcher Lords, who had borne the brunt of the fighting, never fully forgave the Dornish. The old hatreds lingered, passed down from father to son, erupting occasionally in feuds and border skirmishes. But the peace held, because both sides had learned that war was too costly to resume. Dorne, for its part, remained distinct within the Seven Kingdoms. The Dornish did not adopt the customs of the rest of Westeros. They kept their own laws, their own traditions, their own identity. They were Westerosi, yes, but they were Dornish first, and the rest of the realm learned to accept this, because the alternative was another century of war that no one could afford. The story of Dorne's resistance became legendary. Songs were sung about Meria Martell, the blind princess who defied dragons. Stories were told about the Hellholt and the death of Rhaenys, about the young dragon's folly, about Baelor's barefoot walk through the prince's pass. These tales were not just entertainment. They were lessons about the limits of power, the value of persistence, and the importance of knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. For the Dornish themselves, the wars became a source of immense pride. They were the people who had defied the Conqueror. They were the kingdom that never bent. That pride shaped their identity for generations, gave them a sense of uniqueness and superiority that sometimes bordered on arrogance. But it was an earned pride, bought with blood and sacrifice, and no one could take it away from them. For the Targaryens, the wars were a humbling lesson. They had conquered 6 kingdoms with relative ease, but the 7th had proven beyond their reach. It taught them that dragons, powerful as they were, had limits. It showed them that some problems cannot be solved with fire and blood, that sometimes compromise and diplomacy are stronger tools than conquest. This lesson would be forgotten and relearned multiple times throughout Targaryen history. Later, kings would make the same mistakes, would try to impose their will through force alone, and would suffer the consequences. But the lesson was there, written in the sands of Dorne, waiting for those wise enough to read it. The Dornish Wars also changed the nature of warfare in Westeros. Before Dorne, War was primarily about pitched battles between armies, about sieges and single combat, and chivalric codes. Dorne showed that there were other ways to fight: asymmetric warfare, guerrilla tactics, popular resistance. These methods were not considered honourable by the standards of Westerosi knighthood, but they were effective, and effectiveness matters more than honour when your survival is at stake. In later years, when other regions faced occupation or oppression, they would sometimes look to the Dornish example. When the Ironborn tried to hold the north, when rebellious lords fought against the Iron Throne, they used tactics the Dornish had pioneered: ambushes, raids, refusal to engage in open battle. The Dornish Wars had proven that a determined population could resist even overwhelming force, and that lesson spread throughout the realm. The peace that Balor negotiated lasted for generations. There were tensions, occasional incidents, moments when it seemed the old hatreds might reignite. But the treaty held because both sides had too much to lose from its collapse. The Iron Throne needed Dorne's cooperation to maintain the fiction of the Seven Kingdoms. Dorne needed the protection and trade opportunities that came with being part of the realm. It was a partnership based on mutual interest. Not love, but it worked. Over time, the distinctions between Dorne and the rest of Westeros began to blur slightly. Dornish nobles married into houses from other regions. Dornish traders did business throughout the realm. Dornish customs influenced the south, while northern customs found their way into Dorne. The integration was slow, incomplete, and always respectful of Dorne's unique identity. But it happened. Yet even centuries later, when asked who they were, the Dornish would answer with their region first, their kingdom second. They were Dornish, people of the sun and sand, heirs to the Rhoynar and the traditions of resistance. They were part of the Seven Kingdoms, yes, but they had never truly bent. They had joined because they chose to, on terms they found acceptable, and that made all the difference. The words of House Martell, unbowed, unbent, unbroken, were not just a motto. They were a declaration of identity, a statement of historical fact, and a promise for the future. The Dornish had proven those words true through a century of war. They had faced dragons and armies, endured burnings and massacres, lost everything and rebuilt it again. And through it all, they had remained themselves. This is what Meria Martell meant when she told Aegon's messenger, "You may burn us, but you will not bend us." She was not just threatening resistance. She was stating a fundamental truth about her people. The Dornish identity was not something that could be destroyed by fire or conquered by force. It was woven too deeply into their culture, their history, their sense of self. You could kill individual Dornish men and women, but you could not kill what it meant to be Dornish. And so, Dorne survived, not unchanged. No people emerges from a century of war without scars. But they survived as themselves, on their own terms, having never surrendered the core of their identity. They had paid a terrible price for that survival, but they had deemed it worth paying. And when peace finally came, it came because the Iron Throne acknowledged what the Dornish had always known. Some things cannot be taken, only given. The question that historians still debate is whether the war was necessary. Could Aegon have negotiated with Meria from the beginning, offering the same terms that Balor eventually gave? Would Dorne have joined the realm peacefully if offered partnership instead of conquest? Or was the century of war inevitable? a clash between two incompatible visions of power that could only be resolved through exhaustion and compromise. We will never know the answer. What we do know is that the war happened, that it lasted for generations, and that in the end, Dorne won the victory that mattered most, the preservation of their freedom and identity. They lost battles, lost territory temporarily, lost countless lives. But they won the war, because the war was never about defeating the Targaryens militarily. It was about refusing to become something they were not. And in that refusal, they were victorious. The story of Dorne's resistance is not just a piece of history. It is a reminder that power has limits, that determination can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds, and that sometimes the greatest victories are achieved not through conquest, but through endurance. It is a story about the price of freedom and the willingness to pay that price, no matter how high. For anyone who has ever faced impossible odds, who has ever been told to surrender or be destroyed, who has ever had to choose between freedom and safety, the story of Dorne offers both inspiration and warning. Inspiration, because it shows that resistance is possible, that even the mightiest empires can be defied. Warning, because it shows the cost of that resistance, the suffering that must be endured, the sacrifices that must be made. The Dornish paid that cost willingly. They made those sacrifices without hesitation, and in doing so, they proved that some things, identity, freedom, the right to govern oneself, are worth any price. That is the legacy of the Dornish Wars, and it is a legacy that will endure as long as people remember the blind princess who stared down dragons, the desert that swallowed armies, and the unconquerable spirit of a people who would not bend. If you have walked through this history and found yourself thinking differently about power, about resistance, about what it means to truly win, then you are not alone. The story of Dorne challenges our assumptions about strength and weakness, about victory and defeat. It reminds us that the strongest fortress is not made of stone, but of will, and that the greatest weapon is not the sword or the dragon, but the refusal to accept defeat. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Dorne was right to resist, or should they have submitted to save lives? Could the Targaryens have conquered them if they had tried harder? Or was Dorne truly unconquerable? And what lessons do you think this history holds for us today, whether in our own lives or in the world around us? If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most fascinating chapters of Westerosi history, and if you want more explorations of the hidden corners of the world of ice and fire, you know what to do. There are countless stories yet to be told, countless mysteries yet to be unravelled, and I would be honoured to be your guide through them all. The Dornish Wars are over. The peace has held for centuries, but the memory remains, carved into the red sands and the mountain peaks, written in the blood of those who refuse to kneel. Unbowed, unbent, unbroken. These are not just words. They are the truth of Dorne, proven through fire and suffering, and no dragon, no army, no king will ever change them. That is the story of Meria Martell and the Dornish Wars. That is the story of how a small kingdom defied the greatest power in the world and won. And that is a story worth remembering, now and always. And so we come to the end of our journey through the sands and mountains of Dorne, through a century of fire and blood, through the story of a people who refused to bow. The tale of Meria Martell and the Dornish Wars is unlike any other in the history of Westeros. It is not a story of glorious conquest or tragic defeat. It is a story of endurance, of patience turned into a weapon, of a small kingdom that understood something the mightiest empire in the world did not. That some victories are won not by fighting harder, but by refusing to lose. Princess Meria, blind and ancient, gave her people a gift more valuable than any castle or crown. She gave them the certainty that their freedom was worth any sacrifice, and that certainty carried them through 100 years of war. She never lived to see the peace, never knew that her defiance would one day be vindicated. But her words, "You may burn us, but you will not bend us," became the soul of Dorne, echoing through generations long after she was dust. The Targaryens learned, slowly and painfully, that dragons have limits. Fire can destroy, but it cannot compel. Fear can break individuals, but it cannot break a people united in their refusal to surrender. Aegon the Conqueror, who had bent 6 kingdoms to his will in a matter of years, spent the rest of his life trying and failing to conquer the 7th. Rhaenys died in the attempt. Daeron the young dragon threw away his life, and 50,000 others chasing the same impossible dream. Only Baelor the Blessed had the wisdom, or perhaps the madness, to see the truth. Dorne could not be conquered, it could only be invited. And when he made that invitation, offering partnership instead of subjugation, Dorne finally joined the 7 kingdoms. Not because they were defeated, but because they chose to. And that choice made all the difference. The Dornish won their war, not in a single battle, not through military genius, but through sheer, stubborn, unyielding persistence. They won by being willing to lose everything except the one thing that mattered most, their identity. They won by understanding that freedom is not given, it is claimed, and it is held by those willing to pay its price. This is a story that resonates far beyond the pages of history. It speaks to anyone who has ever faced impossible odds, who has ever been told that resistance is futile, who has ever had to choose between comfort and conviction. The Dornish chose conviction, and in doing so they became immortal. Their legacy lives on in the Red Mountains and the burning sands, in the castles they rebuilt and the traditions they preserved. It lives on in their words, unbowed, unbent, unbroken, which are not merely a boast but a historical truth, written in the blood of those who proved it. So, what do you think? Was Dorne right to resist, or did their pride cost too many lives? Could the Targaryens have conquered them if they had tried a different strategy? Or was Dorne's geography and determination truly an unbeatable combination? And what does this story teach us about power, about resistance, about the price of freedom? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. Tell me which moment in this long, bitter struggle struck you hardest. Tell me if you see the Dornish as heroes or as stubborn fools who prolonged unnecessary suffering. Tell me what you think would have happened if Aegon had offered Baelor's terms from the very beginning. And if this deep dive into the Dornish Wars left you hungry for more tales from the world of ice and fire, if you want to explore the hidden corners of Westeros and Essos, the forgotten histories and the mysterious prophecies, then subscribe. There are countless stories waiting to be told. The Blackfire rebellions, the dance of the dragons, the rise and fall of old Valyria, the secrets of the others, and the origins of the Long Night. This is just one chapter in the vast, bloody, beautiful history of A Song of Ice and Fire. But it is a chapter worth remembering, because it reminds us that the mightiest dragons can be defied, that the smallest kingdoms can stand against empires, and that the greatest victories sometimes come not from winning battles, but from refusing to lose who you are. The Dornish Wars are over, the dragons are gone, but the lesson remains, carved into the stones of Sunspear and written in the annals of history. Some peoples cannot be conquered, some spirits cannot be broken, and some prices are worth paying, no matter how high. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the sands of Dorne. Until next time, remember, the North remembers. But Dorne never forgets, and Dorne never bends. Unbowed, unbent, unbroken, always.